Welcome to episode 16 of True Words, a Shingon Buddhist podcast. It quite literally from the Chinese as law. And this gives the impression of a very rigid concept that's very inflexible and sort of a set of rules or guidelines that we have to fulfill or follow in life. It's begun to be used more widely in the same way as the terms karma and sangha. So as they've left their original meanings and their scope broadened and entered the popular lexicon, the understanding of these terms in the Western world is often quite different from the intent that was used in Asia and within Buddhist concepts. Someone once asked me, why does it seem that the point of religion is to not have fun? I found this very interesting, and usually what we do is focus on what not to do, what we're asked to avoid. And so we naturally have to ask ourselves, does Buddhism have these suggestions? Well, yes, Buddhism does give us suggestions for things to avoid or behavior that we should follow. But before I go on, I want you to ask yourself, why? Why are these aspects present? I want you to investigate the reasons for these suggestions rather than focus on what the rules are specifically. Within Buddhism, they aren't handed down or established arbitrarily. There's always a reason, and the reason is very instructive. So, how do you know if a teaching is a Buddhist teaching? So what is Buddhadharma versus some other Dharma? The Buddhist Dharma is generally said to have 3 marks, and within Buddhism it's referred to as the 3 marks of his existence. So all teachings within Buddhism have these features or accord with these concepts. So what are these 3? Impermanence, suffering, and not self. So are these specifically Buddhist concepts? Not exactly. From the Buddhist perspective, these things are observations of the world. So the Buddha didn't create them or decree them. Rather, the Buddhist explanation would be that these are characteristics observable in the natural world, and we, as part of that natural world, also have these characteristics. So I'm going to try to touch on each one briefly, as each could be topics for separate podcasts or even several lectures. While these ideas are presented, it's important to not take them as rigid lists, but rather 3 opportunities or directions of investigation. The Buddhadharma isn't demanding that you accept them, but rather asks, what do you think? What is your experience with these ideas? It invites you to apply these concepts to your own experience of life and then ask bigger questions from there. So the first mark of existence, impermanence. Looking out at the world, our life, everything we experience, we can observe that impermanence exists. We can point to nothing that is ever enduring, unchanged, or constant. In fact, we can say that one constant in life is change. Usually we associate our experience of change with negative feelings. Something isn't the same as it used to be, or we say, oh, I remember when, or my favorite, well, when I was younger. It seems that most often this general dissatisfaction is focused on serving size of food. I know that my parents always told me that ice creams were bigger in their childhood. So things are always bigger or better in our memory. So that may be the negative or downside of impermanence, but actually there's a positive side. Situations that we don't find pleasurable will also pass away. Improvement is only possible due to change. Without change, our lives would likely be monotonous. The Buddhadharma asks us to keep this concept in mind as we explore the sutras and our meditation practice. The next mark of existence, suffering. Actually, the Sanskrit word is dukkha. It's usually translated as suffering, but this concept is maybe a little too rigid. Actually, it's more like stress or discontent. Things get on our nerves. Things build up and become magnified in our consciousness, and we begin to label these things displeasurable. Sometimes they're very low grade, a squeaky part of our car, certain social interactions that we prefer to avoid. These things become magnified due to our tendency to focus on them in advance. We generate apprehension, which naturally then magnifies the sensation and emotions of that actual experience. The next concept is not self, and this is perhaps the most difficult of the 3 marks. remembering the truth of impermanence here can perhaps ease us into this one. It may be easier to ask, what part of us is eternal and changeless? I know for myself, my interests have changed and evolved over time. My body has changed as well. I'm taller now than I was when I was a child, for example. My mind has changed, both the things that capture my interest, catch my attention, the types of music I listen to, the thoughts are different from moment to moment. Everything about myself is changing from moment to moment, from day to day, year to year. With all of this change, inside and outside, and all around this body that is speaking to you now, where's the self? Actually, the Buddhadharma points out that we have a collection of changing thoughts, ideas, concepts, and actions in a container that is also changing. We can conveniently label or call this container me or I or the self. Understanding that there is no permanent self that we can point to is helpful in our exploration of the Buddhadharma. It can be a little scary to think of this and difficult to grasp. Part of what is happening in meditation is developing an awareness of this. It's a concept so new, maybe even shocking, that we need to have an experience of it rather than just hear and attempt to understand it rationally. Part of this practice is called meditation. Once we have some working knowledge of these ideas, then what? Someone may think, gee, these all seem somewhat negative or presented from the perspective of things that I don't like about life. Where are the positive things? Remember, the Buddhadharma is meant to turn our attention to certain aspects about our existence that are helpful in waking us up to what is really going on. If the teaching were to only invite us to stop and smell the roses, admire the sunset, this sort of perspective, it would not be effective in waking us up to other truths about life. Sometimes a person's obstacle is that they have dropped into depression or a loop of negative feelings directed inwards. They should perhaps have a different starting point, and here is the importance of a teacher or someone to help direct you to a medicine that is right for you at that time and in your circumstance. In the same way, many of us find our way in school towards what interests us, usually because we don't know on the first day of all the possible professions, trades, or causes to apply ourselves to. When we find the right one, there can be an aha moment. So there are many spiritual paths, many Buddhist paths even. Which one do we choose? How can we trust one over another? What characteristics can we look for to ensure that we are following the right Dharma? So what characteristics can we find in the Buddhadharma? The first is precepts, and we have to ask ourselves, why is this important? There's one reason, first of all. No one owns the word Buddhism or Buddhadharma. There's no copyright, so anyone can claim that term, can place it on their building, put it in their book, or attempt to sell you a set of teachings that are labeled Buddhism. Precepts are one way to discern whether the Buddhadharma is real or fake. If you buy an item, you want to determine whether it's real or not. The same is probably true with anything that you're going to let into your body, a real food product versus some fake product that might harm your health. Shouldn't we be as concerned about what we allow into our minds? Unfortunately, these days we're often told to believe the person or group with the loudest or fanciest message or messenger. So what kind of precepts? So Buddhism includes precepts against misuse of our body, speech, and mind. Such things as harming living beings, taking what is not given, speaking carelessly or abusively, thoughts of greed or holding ill will towards others. This type of behavior is to be avoided. So is this moralizing for no reason or some sort of social control? From the Buddhist perspective, it's not. We're asking practitioners to look at the effects of these actions towards others, societies, and ourselves. The Buddhadharma is asking us to look closely at the ways these actions manifest, what they do to others, and what they do to us, and inviting us to analyze how that effect changes our mind, our thoughts, and our perspectives on life. Why else are precepts present? What's the effect on your practice? If you attempt to cultivate wisdom or start a meditation practice, the biggest issue people seem to struggle with is that they have a hard time turning their minds off. Precepts are offered by the Buddha as foundations upon which to set our meditation practice. By following the precepts, by integrating those ideas into our life, our distracted thoughts are reduced, and our meditation and our practice, even our lives and our interaction with others, the quality of that is improved. Another thing is missing here, and that's lack of judgment. There's no need to judge yourself, and especially others. Oftentimes, people associate judgment with a spiritual path, and all too often, judgment or feelings about being judged then become our next obstacle. So within Buddhism, there's no judgment. There's only recognition, realization, and practices for repentance once we've realized that our behavior is not conducive to the spiritual path or as a good foundation for society, our community, or our spiritual practice. So this aspect of precepts is a good tool to use to determine if what you are hearing accords with the Buddhadharma or not. If someone is justifying killing or saying that intoxicants, despite clouding your thoughts, are actually helpful for your spiritual path, you now have some of the tools to navigate this sort of situation. Another important concept within Buddhism is the law of cause and effect. In fact, it's a fundamental concept underlying the Buddhist explanation of our experience and the laws of the universe. It's an even simpler way of explaining karma. Karma is perhaps the most misunderstood concept in Buddhism, or misused word or concept within Buddhism. If you go on YouTube and search instant karma, you won't see anything good. In the West, we usually think of it as something negative. Karma is neither good nor bad. It's good to keep this perspective in mind. Why? Because we get one of two general perspectives in life. We avoid all change, decay, loss, death, decrease, anything that we perceive as displeasurable. We tend to gravitate towards things, people that we enjoy. Or we're always being sold some product or service to increase our wealth, lifespan, or something that guarantees our happiness. So why is this important to keep in mind? Everything, even the spiritual path, is sold to us these days. The key to happiness, youth, abundance, enjoyment, it's always more, more, more. But leaving out other aspects of life isn't very realistic. What about the times when there is less, loss, and old age, when our body no longer conforms to the examples provided by society? Now what about your Dharma? When we consider our own Dharma, perhaps we're referring to a set of guidelines by which we live, or a basis from which we make decisions, or a particular self-image that we project and therefore conform our actions to in order to maintain. How do you explain it or encapsulate it? Through experiences and sensations of the body? Through what processes have we come to these conclusions? Socrates said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." The Buddhadharma is inviting us to examine our life, motivation, influences, and most importantly, our mind. Who is in charge? Who is driving the car? Our sensations, emotions, desires, or our minds free of those influences? In the ancient world, people sought the meaning of virtue, concepts like wisdom, justice, piety, courage, and whether these were natural concepts or something humanity had created. Today there is more focus on individual rights, so the individual becomes more focused on their own desires, cravings, interest, often without examining larger concerns. Sometimes we come to the conclusion that so long as we aren't hurting anyone else, we aren't doing any harm. In considering our own Dharma, I would suggest giving consideration to our progress. Is our mind calm? Do we give consideration to others? Do we take an ends justify the means approach? Oftentimes, when we think of religion, we think of it as only a bunch of rules. I would invite you to look at Buddhism as a framework of analysis. Perhaps we have our own Dharma, system of analysis currently, but for over 2,600 years, the Buddhadharma has influenced people and societies. Perhaps there is something for us to learn here. All human knowledge is built on earlier discoveries. It's much easier to observe that the wheel is a useful invention and utilize it rather than start over again. If you've spent any time looking at Buddhism you may notice that there appear to be many explanations of things. Why is this? Simply, the Buddha had a long life, and what he taught was largely the result of questions from students. So imagine now a school that you attend, and while there is a curriculum, the teacher, however, doesn't have a lesson plan ready. Rather, the teacher waits for questions from students and uses those questions as teachable moments. This is very similar to the Socratic method. Simply speaking, the Buddhadharma is this collection of teachings, and the various schools of Buddhism are concentrations on specific portions of the teachings and their methods. There seems to be an interest in the West at discovering the original or early Buddhist teaching. I would caution that in many ways this is not a rediscovery, but a creation. How can a living tradition that does not practice this imagined early original teaching be resurrected? The existing schools of Buddhism are both focuses on practice, reactions to historical events, and cultural and regional needs. The teaching at the core of the packaging is the same. What body of knowledge is not like this? Even the exhibits at the Smithsonian are wrapped in the history of the properties in which they are exhibited and the tradition of curation developed for that purpose. Shingon is the same way. It's wrapped in historical events, cultural concepts, and language. That wrapper, however, holds a great deal of knowledge and experience for our own transformation. Discarding it in a search for some eternal, untouched core discards a great deal of the supports and knowledge learned along the way. So I'll give you an example. Some years ago, I was making mochi, rice cakes made from short grain rice for the New Year celebrations at the temple. Having not grown up in a Japanese community, it was my first time, so I made many mistakes, and those mistakes served as good entertainment for the other volunteers at the temple. With more practice, the mochi I made began to look more and more like the other volunteers and not so lopsided. One of the older members noted that the mochi made in Hawaii was never quite right. The New Year's mochi in Japan is made at a time of year when the weather is much colder, so the mochi cooled and retained its plump shape. Because of the heat, our mochi would cool and flatten out into discs like pancakes. That member was never quite satisfied with the end result, but worked hard at the mochi making nevertheless. Now, when I see mochi offered to the Buddhas at temples, I understand. With a single glance, information that was hidden from me before now is very clear. Perhaps the flavor is the same, but the experience and education are vastly different. Maybe we can take a lesson from many modern cooking shows. Rather than giving you just the recipe, they now explore the culture and the meaning of the ingredients. Maybe interviewing the chef and learning their history and story, discovering who they learned from, what their greatest lessons were, and how they translate that into the food they produce now. I find these shows the most interesting and memorable. It increases my understanding and appreciation of food, and especially the life experience and perspective of others. So is there one Dharma or many Dharmas? If the Dharma is one thing, why are there so many schools of Buddhism? There are many perspectives on practice. The same Dharma can be practiced in more than one way. But this is not the same as our Dharma as compared to the Buddhadharma. Everyone wants happiness. The Buddhadharma can be said to lead people towards happiness, not through some shortcut method or X number of easy steps or a money-back guarantee, but rather through practice that allows body and mind to feel unified, because we are free of obstructions such as stress, burdens, self-doubt, and judgment. So here we're talking about a happiness that is a result of feeling light, at ease, the result of losing rather than gaining. Losing stress, baggage, habits that aren't helpful, maybe even losing our smartphone so that we have less distractions. And in turn, gaining a new perspective, tools, time, friends even. How is this attained? By attending to the needs of others, consideration of others, and putting others first. This is a key to Buddhist practice, and it's called compassion. That's probably why each time there's a survey of happiness, the people with the least report the greatest happiness, but also usually report the closest friendships and family relationships, meaning less self-focus and more group focus. Hard times are inevitable parts of life. The Buddhadharma is a comprehensive explanation of our life, our mind, and the meaning of practicing to discover this joy that arises from putting these teachings, the Buddhadharma, into practice. I hope this has been helpful in giving consideration to our own creeds, personal philosophies on life, and the Buddhadharma. Thank you.